And I think, are we set to begin?
So yeah, we're live now, and then we're just going to give it a minute for people to join in. I see the number of attendees increasing. So, okay. Okay, we can start now. Hello, everyone. My name is Yunus Zangiabadi. I am the Executive Vice President of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. I would like to welcome you all to our second panel of the day, titled Great Power Competition in the Middle East. For this part, I'm only responsible for introducing our esteemed moderator, who was kind to accept our invitation to moderate this timely and important panel. Kelly Velaz is the Editorial Director of Responsible Statecraft and Senior Advisor at the Quincy Institute. Previously, she served for 3 years as Executive Editor of the American Conservative magazine, where she has been reporting and publishing regular articles on national security, civil liberties, foreign policy, and Washington politics since 2007. She's also spent 15 years as an online political reporter for Fox News at the channel's Washington, D.C. Bureau, as well as Washington correspondent for Homeland Security Today magazine. With this brief introduction, I would like to hand over the floor to Kelly. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Yunus, and thank you for that great introduction. And good afternoon to everybody out there, and welcome to our second panel of the day, Great Power Competition in the Middle East. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the Institute as well for holding this incredibly interesting and important event today. Obviously, this is a critical moment to be talking about great power competition in the Middle East and what is going on with Israel-Palestine efforts to end the war in Yemen, the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan, negotiations over the Iran nuclear deal, the proxy wars in Libya, and continuing peace and efforts in Syria. All of that is coming into play at this very moment. While the United States has signaled a shift away from those regional conflicts, reflected by Biden's decision to halt American backing for Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the U.S. is still directly involved in what is happening right now in Israel, having supported Benjamin Netanyahu's government with political support and military aid, as well as its vote in the UN. Washington also continues to have troops stationed across the region. Meanwhile, Russia and China have significantly maintained and even expanded their own regional activities. On one hand, the Kremlin has maintained its military presence in Syria. On the other hand, China has signaled an unprecedented 25-year strategic agreement with Iran. As the global power structure continues to shift, it is essential to analyze the future of the U.S. presence under the Biden administration, explore the emerging global rivalry with Russia and China, and at last investigate the implications of this competition for peace and security in the Middle East. We have a groaning table of issues here, obviously, and I am proud to moderate a panel with very esteemed experts on the region. So I'm going to introduce them. I want to give you a little bit of their background, and then we'll get the conversation going because we don't have a ton of time. And as I said, we have a ton to talk about. So I'd like to introduce at first Dr. Andrew Mikda. He is the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the Marshall Center. Prior to that, he was Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and an affiliate of the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. From 1988 to 2015, he was the M.W. Buckman Distinguished Professor of International Studies at Rhodes College. He's a contributing editor for the American Interest and a regular contributor at Carnegie Europe's flagship blog, Strategic Europe. His most recent book with Paul Hilde is The Future of NATO, regional defense, and global security. Next, we have Dmitry Trenin, has been the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center since 2008. Trenin joined the center in 1994, prior to which he had served in the Soviet Russian military. While in the military, Trenin served in Iraq, East Germany, West Berlin, and Switzerland, and was a senior research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. Trenin has authored a number of books, including What Russia is Up to in the Middle East in 2018. Next, we have Dr. Roxanne Vermont, is Director of International Studies and Global Politics at University of Cambridge Institute for Continuing Education and a Senior Research Fellow at King's College in London. She lectures on the modern Middle East at the Cambridge Department of Politics and is a frequent speaker and media commentator on current Middle East affairs, particularly on Iran and the Gulf. Previously a journalist, she includes among her publications Blood and Oil, a prince's memoir of Iran from the Shah to the Ayatollah, and Media and Political Transition in the Southern Mediterranean. And last but not least, Dr. Joost Hilderman is the main program director at International Crisis Group. He is also the former executive director of Human Rights Watch's Arms Division, former research coordinator at Palestinian Human Rights Organization. He is an author of A Poisonous Affair, America, Iraq, and the Gassing of Halabja, and Behind the Intifada, Labor and Women's Movements in the Occupied Territories. He is also a contributor to New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, New York Times, and Foreign Affairs, and is a lecturer at SAIS, Georgetown, and the University of Kent. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here today and trying to really cast a light on some of these very problematic issues, but important issues of our day in terms of great power competition in the Middle East. So I'd like to start with what's probably the most burning question at the moment, and that is what is going on in Israel-Palestine right now. We all know of the continued bombings in Gaza. We know of the politics that led to the bombings and the unrest in Israel proper, and the dynamics that have existed for decades, obviously. But I'd like to start by asking, and I think, Roxanne, I'd like to ask, Joost, I'd like to ask this of you first. Given all of what's happening and the dynamics that are at play here, can you talk a little bit about what external great powers can do or are doing at this moment to engage with this conflict, to help resolve the issues here, what role they might play in mediating the tensions between the Palestinian factions and the Israeli government, and anything that you can sort of lend in terms of what the external picture is right now?
Thank you, Kelly. I'd be very pleased to do it. And thank you, of course, to the Institute for organizing this conference and this panel and inviting me to speak on it. So it's clear that in the Israel-Palestine conflict, the United States continues to be the preponderant external power. It has all the main cards in its hands. And that means that any solution, short-term in terms of the fighting that is currently going on, or longer term, still rests with the United States playing probably the major role in it. That doesn't mean that there is no role for other external powers. We've seen Russia, of course, trying to, certainly claiming to speak to all sides, probably is, and trying to mediate and offering its good offices. We've seen China, and I have to say, if you've seen the statement by the Chinese permanent rep to the United Nations in New York last Sunday, it was the most sensible statement coming out of any of the members of the Security Council. Very pragmatic and quite, even-handed, which is what we cannot expect from the United States at this point or even in the past. So, but the bottom line is that the United States will drive this issue for now, and if there's a ceasefire, it will be because the United States basically tells Israel to knock it off, but it will not do so until Israel has said that it has accomplished the military objectives that it seeks to accomplish. And I think we're very close to that. because there's the law of diminishing returns, and there's very little left to destroy and to kill, even though because everybody now is gone into deep hiding on the Gaza side. When it comes to other mediating external powers, we have the regional powers. We can talk about the Emirates as because of the normalization deal with Israel, and which is basically sidelined it because the United States is already playing the role of being on Israel's side and having the preponderant power. And the Emirates have to be very careful because the street is with the Palestinians, while the leadership wants to continue its tight relationship with Israel. And I think what we'll see is, first of all, that the Arab world is now divided, not only between regime and people, but also between regimes, those that have sought a peace with Israel and those that have still resisted that. And also between so the Emirates have to be very careful what it does in terms of its own diplomacy. But what you will see is that the bonds between Israel and the Emirates will continue on a security and military level, maybe business as well, but very little on the popular level between the Israeli people, for example, and the Emiratis. Tourism may continue, but it may not be as open. And what we will see instead is something that we've seen between Jordan and Israel and between Egypt and Israel in the past. There's peace, but it's a cold peace. And certainly the Emirates, had promised in some kind of peace dividend that they would stand up for the Palestinians and against Israeli annexation. We've seen none of that. And I think all of that together means that those states that were considering having a closer relationship with Israel will think twice at this point, because they have to keep the popular opinion in mind, and they see that making peace with Israel could have a high cost. But the only exceptions to that, or the ones that now actually could mediate at a regional level, are Egypt, because it has no choice, it has to. It's a neighboring state to the entity that is Gaza. It has an existential interest in what is happening in Gaza, or existential is overstating it, but a strategic interest. And Turkey and Qatar, because they have a good relationship with Hamas. And so they can talk to Hamas, whereas the United States, which deems Hamas a terrorist organization, cannot talk to it, whereas the European Union, which could mediate between Palestinian Authority and Israel, cannot talk to Hamas, and basically has also sidelined itself. So this leaves a role for Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar in particular to mediate where the great powers cannot.
Thank you for that. And what I'd like to do with the panel, I would like to offer, since I'll share this with the audience. What I expected was I would give a question to each of our panelists, or instead of in lieu of an opening statement. But in between that, if there's anybody here on the panel who would like to do like a sort of two fingers follow up to what Yo said, that would be great. Anybody want to jump in on that particular Israel-Palestine issue? Roxanne?
Just very briefly, I think, Joost, you did a fantastic job. I just could possibly add a two-finger on Iran's engagement with Hamas in all of this, because it is being accused of having supported Hamas and provided it with military hardware as part of the equation that we're seeing at the moment in terms of conflict exchange. And indeed, there was a visit just recently over the last several days by a major Hamas leader into Iran. But I think one of the things that this exchange is showing us is the illustration of a policy on Iran's part, which was to stop actually shipments of arms to its various allies and subsidiary groups, and instead enabling them to create the materials on site using a transfer of knowledge and scientific capability. And so I think this is a first example in many ways, certainly on Hamas's part, of being able to use some of the materials that certainly have been transferred to it, but not as final product, not as guns and missiles, but as equipment that it has put together that really illustrates this new policy of Iran, and is one of the reasons why I think Iran is being understood as having a new impact on the region. And this is an example.
Anyone else want to weigh in on Israel-Palestine before we move on? Okay, Roxanne, I'm going to take it over to you now, and in continuing in talking about Iran, but specifically Iran and the US and ongoing negotiations to revive the JCPOA, or more commonly known as the nuclear deal, the Iran nuclear deal. Can there be room for cooperation between the West and Russia and China on helping to preserve this agreement via increased investments and trade with Iran? What do these great powers, what can they lend to these negotiations to actually make it happen and actually make it work better, maybe?
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you very much to the Institute for having me here as part of this illustrious group and dealing with these important questions. If I could just for 1 minute take a look at where we are today, and then I'll address the different approaches for understanding where we are. And I would actually say that I see a major recalibration taking place in the Gulf, and that the negotiations with the JCPOA fall very much within that framework. But it really depends on from which capital one looks at it from, both from the balance of power and the direction of travel, because it could be quite differently understood depending on the capital you happen to be sitting in. But overall, the linchpin is the JCPOA because of its importance in not just the US Iran relationship, but in my view, in the impact it has on regional security. So firstly, of course, we know that Biden, utilizing a number of the original US negotiators for the JCPOA, is in Geneva resuscitating the deal as the EU shuttles back and forth between the Iran and US delegations, which, thanks to Iran's refusal to meet in person, are not operating face to face. These negotiations appear quite isolated from the conflict we've just been discussing in Israel, and also are deflecting in many ways the Republican concerns in Congress that Iran's militias and missiles be included in any renewed deal. I think what we can determine, and I would say showing my own stripes here, rightly recognizing that the JCPOA is in fact a swap over proliferation control and sanctions relief, Biden's team is basically staying very clear of turning that into a discussion of control over weaponry and the regional threats that Iran's position creates, because that in a sense engages then a security framework, and the swap might involve then some security guarantees or a support for an Iran-led or Iran Gulf security regime. And that is something I think the US is well far from at this point. At the same time, the Israeli conflict has, I would say, severely compromised the Abraham Accords, as Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE have all, for the moment, frozen relations with Jerusalem. Another obvious important element to this is the Saudi-Iran talks that are gaining traction at the moment, having started a year prior to Biden taking office, when it became clear that Riyadh could no longer count on blanket support from the United States. And thirdly, I would say the 25-year, $400 billion deal between Iran and China has played a strategic role here, signed in March during Foreign Minister Wang Yi's tour of regional powers in the Gulf region, and in which he proposed a 5-point Middle East initiative. So that's the backdrop. So from Tehran's perspective, Trump's maximum pressure program not only failed to change Iran's behavior, but it failed to recognize a very other important key issue in my view, and that is that regional issues were always part of the JCPOA. The rise in regional instability as a result of the US withdrawal from the deal, along with rising military transfers to Saudi and the UAE, translated into a rise in Iran's own need for geostrategic security and positioning. In other words, I would say that maximum pressure was met by maximum presence on Iran's part. And this was a policy that very interestingly is supported internally in Iran across all political factions. So it's not only by resolving the JCPOA, at least until 2023, that regional issues can be revived among local players. From Abu Dhabi's perspective, this was clear early on and led it to withdraw from the Yemen coalition and to redress relations with Iran, for example, or its attempt to start. Tehran, meanwhile, sees absolutely no role, I think, for the US becoming involved in resolution of the Yemen war. Seeing this purely as a regional issue. It doesn't see Russia being involved. It doesn't see China being involved. For it, the revival of the JCPOA means that a solution now can start being put on the table, particularly in the discussions with Saudi and the UAE. Further, I think that Trump's betrayal of Iran in discarding the JCPOA fundamentally changed the dynamics of the Gulf and the role of different players. First of all, I think the EU lost significant credibility in the region with its inability, showing a certain weakness in being able to find an alternative solution to its own policy commitments to the JCPOA once the US had left. And this really has had multiple implications. But most interesting, I think, is China's role. From Washington's perspective, there was no need to jumpstart the JCPOA, I don't think, despite it being a Biden campaign priority. And that's why it was really slow out of the gate. But when Iran signed the deal with China, it became crystal to Washington that, first of all, it really actually doesn't want China to use Iran as its local gas station in the Gulf. And second of all, it didn't want to open up the possibility, which up until now had been really quite contained, of ensuring that China, to stop China from becoming an arms supplier to Tehran. And we see that once that deal was signed, though no fanfare really attended it, the negotiations in Vienna began. And so in some ways, this reveals two important things. One, that Iran's leverage in the talks has grown with the rising adversarial relationship between the US, Russia, and China, but also that US-Iran conflict has forced China in some sense to take a position on this as a political issue. So from Beijing's perspective, the Gulf is valuable and an opportunity is growing for it to benefit from the resources there, but the risk of involvement, of getting involved at that sort of quagmire that the Middle East always presents, is high. And it has watched both Europe and the US become stuck in the Gulf and Afghanistan, and these have turned into cost centers for both in blood and treasure. So unlike the US during its unipolar moment, China is taking a different view. It's established a broad economic plan in the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is meaning that it's becoming extremely engaged with the states in the region, economically primarily. And Iran and Saudi, I have to admit, are extremely happy to be doing business with a country that does not bang on about human rights demands. Yet, we see nonetheless that China is very pragmatic. Its bulk investments have been in the UAE and in Israel. It has not gotten too involved in the regional hegemons. It has not sold UAVs to Iran, like it has to several of the GCCs, and it is not partnered on a weapons production. So to quickly wrap up, a positive outcome of the JCPOA negotiations will, in my view, lead to multipolarity in the Gulf that will be more stable than the hegemony period that has been practiced by the US over the last couple of decades or several decades. And this is particularly germane in light of the vagaries of US politics, where a Trump-like president may again take the helm in a few years, and because the sunsets in key elements of the JCPOA will also require rethinking after 2023. Russia has stayed out of the Gulf region generally, though Iran and the Gulf are its near abroad. And its role has really been to support Iran against Western and Gulf fears of proliferation on the premise that Iran is not building a bomb, but instead using the nuclear program as a political tool for leverage. Moscow's focus has really been in the Mediterranean, but that's another question that I have a feeling we'll be discussing later. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that. There's a great staging of all the dynamics that are at play there. Does anybody have a two finger that they'd like to weigh in particularly on that issue? Or well, we can move on. Actually, I'd like to move on to Andrew because Roxanne, you did bring up the whole issue of China and the Middle East, and it's making its way with its Belt and Road and other agreements. Andrew, as the Biden administration continues this sort of slow extrication, or at least the perception of a slow extrication from the Middle East in its pivot to Asia, to what extent will this policy impact U.S. military presence in the region, meaning less, and how will that open up space for both China and Russia to be further involved in the Middle East? And do the two countries have overlapping interests, which I'm sure they do, but is that outweighed by some of the competitory or the issues that might put them at odds in the region? Can you maybe lay that out for us? Broaden this out to Russia as well.
Thank you, Kelly. And before I engage, let me preface my comments by saying that I'm speaking in my private capacity as an analyst, and my views here do not represent the official position or policy of the U.S. government, the Marshall Center, and the German MOD. I don't like the term pivot to Asia for the following reason. Great powers don't pivot. If we're talking about great power competition, I would like to talk about the reality catching up with us after 20 years of essentially transformative strategy pursued in the region. I, as you know, have been very critical of this approach from the very beginning. The notion that we were going to engage in state building, democracy building, and so forth on a scale that was envisioned as a panacea for the impact of 9/11 and its consequences, I think has been misguided. We are waking up, and I think this started already with the Obama administration, carried on through the Trump administration, and is now going to register with the Biden administration. We're waking up to the reality of number one, resource constraints when it comes to what the US military capabilities have become after 20 years of essentially counterinsurgency operations. I mean, Afghanistan and Iraq alone, that's about $6 trillion in expenditure, about 15,000 casualties just for these two campaigns. Number two, we are facing arguably a more challenging global geostrategic situation than we really had at any time in the 20th century and going to the 21st century, because we in effect are confronting not one, but two military near-peer competitors, that's Russia and China. Secretary Austin recently testified that China is now viewed as a pacing military threat. And although Russian economy is very small relative to what China represents or what we represent, but Russian military capabilities are very significant. So that's one part of the puzzle. The second one is, unlike in the Cold War, where competition and containment and the rest of it essentially pointed us towards one near-peer competitor. China was a regional player at that time, and after Nixon, it realigned to help us leverage that equation. We now have two de facto aligned powers, Russia and China. Not that they necessarily share some broad conceptual vision of the future, but this is the good old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Russia, in my view, wants to revise the post-Cold War settlement, not just in Europe, but all along the periphery, and that includes the Middle East. And China wants to replace it. China wants to replace the order that the United States put in place at the end of the Cold War, with one built on its values and interests. Which brings me again to capabilities. In 2019, just before COVID hit, we had about 70,000 troops deployed in the Middle East area. In comparison, we had 65,000 troops in Europe, roughly in total. US Army Europe at that time was about 35,000. And then we had about 80,000 troops deployed in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific region. We are now getting very serious about shoring up deterrence and defense in both theaters. So Indo-Pacific and Europe, we stood up the 5th Army Corps in Poland. We are now in the midst of the Defender 21 exercise, which brings me to the following point. If you look at the National Security Strategy from 2017 and then the National Defense Strategy from 2018, and there's a very brief unclassified summary that Secretary Mattis at the time released, we're clearly, I don't like that term, but we're clearly downgrading where the region is in the overall set of priorities for what the U.S. Joint Force has to practice for, strategize for, and be ready to engage. We are now looking, after 20 years of essentially counterinsurgency that restructured our military, that actually took us away from the environment where we are now confronted, the competitors who may dominate the airspace, where we don't have dominations of cyber, where our units and our assets cannot be visible, and on and on and on. So we need to build a different force. What that means from my perspective for the Middle East is that we're almost kind of cycling full circle to the time when we actually knew how to do power balancing strategies rather than transformative strategies. Iran is a problem for the United States, but Iran with Russia or Iran with China becomes a very, very big problem for us because it's access to military power, it's access to nuclear technology potentially, and the rest of it. So I think the challenge for us, and I'll conclude my opening remarks on this, will be how to actually properly understand the role of the Middle East in this new era of great power competition, how to actually understand what resources we can commit to the region, and at the same time, make sure that we can leverage our alliances, our alignments, our friends, to make sure that we don't create a void in the region that would allow then for the non-regional great powers, I'm talking about China and Russia, to enter it and dominate. It's going to be a very difficult play. For the last 2 decades, we've forgotten how to do it because of this preponderance of pouvoir in the sense that we can manage every single issue out there with our own resources. That time has passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Does anybody have a follow-up, two-finger on that? Okay, let's move on to Dimitri, because you both, Andrew, Roxanne, and Joost, have raised issues that I think are going to play into this next question. We haven't mentioned Syria yet in the conversation and the role that Russia and Turkey are playing in that country today. The United States has indicated that it has no plans to rejoin the Astana process in Syria without the U.S. presence. To what extent will these negotiations, which do include Russia and Turkey, succeed in bringing about sustainable peace and security in Syria? And what will be the role of this process in helping Syria's reconstruction? Dimitri, can you tackle that question for us?
Well, I'll try. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. Let me say that Astana has been fairly quiet since the start of the pandemic. There was one meeting in Sochi earlier this year, but no progress, no significant progress at least, has been achieved. I think that Russia is far less hopeful than it used to be about the potential of Astana to bring about reconstruction of post-war reconstruction of Syria. I think that rather than discussing ways of international, including the West, that means including the United States and Europe, international reconstruction effort in Syria, Russia is thinking more in terms of major power competition, just the subject matter of today's discussion. Astana has, again, I wouldn't say it's reached some sort of a deadlock, but it's almost not moving. It's the structures there, contacts continue at some level, but the work of the Constitutional Committee has not yet started working on the text of the Constitution. And meanwhile, President Assad is staging another presidential election next week, which to a lot of his opponents in Syria is something that they will never agree with. I would say that for Russia, the situation is in Syria is far from being what was originally intended. Russia also using Syria, having used it to fight off potential threat of jihadis to Russia itself, having reestablished itself as a great power by means of its military intervention in Syria, having achieved significant military results in Syria. Russia was hoping for a period of time in the last few years that Syria would also be a platform where it would be able to reach some sort of a deal with the United States. And just remember the countless hours that Minister Lavrov spent with Secretary Kerry in 2016 trying to put together some form of a formula for a political settlement in Syria, and that Syria would also lead to closer collaboration between Russia and the European Union, not just in that part of the Middle East, but more broadly in the region. These hopes have been dispelled since. So basically, Russia has to rely on what it actually was able to achieve. It has achieved a military presence. It can use Syria as a platform for the region. It uses Syria as a training camp for its military, and the bulk of the Russian Air Force and many other branches of the Russian military have been through Syria, and that is valuable, very valuable combat experience that otherwise Russia has not had since the end of the Chechen War, and that was a very special war. And Russia is also using its success, military success, I wouldn't call it victory, but certainly it was a notable success to raise its profile across the region, from the Gulf to North Africa, as a country that stands by its allies, as a military that can do something. And this has paid off in terms of arms sales, investments, closer relations with fellow oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia and other nations. But otherwise, it doesn't look like there's going to be a closure to Russia's intervention in Syria. It's going to be a long-term proposition for which, frankly, any strategy, long-term strategy, regional strategy is still lacking. I would say that Russia is very interested, focused, and concerned about the southern strategic axis that runs through Donbass, the Black Sea, the Caspian, through the Caucasus, the East Med, all the way to North Africa and the Indo-Pacific. But there's no grand design to impose. There's no ideology to promote, and there's basically no overarching strategy, as I said just a couple of minutes ago, for Russia to pursue. It looks like there's a sum of parts. There's a sum of more or less successive strategies. There's some significant payoff. And maybe the biggest thing is that when you discuss great power competition, major power competition, after a hiatus of 20-something years, you again include Russia. And that's fair enough for Moscow at this point.
Had to get unmuted there, sorry. I'm going to have a two-finger question on that, just a follow-up question. Dimitri or anybody else that wants to jump in. I know that the United States, its first justification for being in Syria was to battle ISIS. Then there was Iran. The justification was keeping Iran's influence at bay. Can you speculate on whether or not under Biden, the U.S. might be dragged back in to Syria? I know we still have troops there. We just don't know how many. But is there a legitimate reason for the United States to remain involved militarily in Syria? What would that be? Or should they just really get out?
Well, I don't think it's a question primarily to somebody sitting in Moscow. I would only say that Russian officials or policymakers do not regard the United States as being completely on the way out from the region. The United States is regrouping its immense assets globally. There's less emphasis on the Middle East. A lot of fingers have been burned, and Andrew talked about the tremendous expenses and the very painful losses that the United States has sustained since its intervention in Iraq at the beginning of this century. But the United States will continue to be the predominant power around the world and also in the Middle East. I don't think that Russia pretends that it can take that role, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the interest, doesn't have the will. So it's something, I'm talking about U.S. presence, including in Syria, that very few Russians believe is going to end very soon. Foreign Minister Lavrov recently, referring to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, said that at least, this is very interesting, he referred to the U.S. withdrawal and then he stopped and then he said, at least that was the announcement. And that gives you some sense of how the Russians regard American plans to withdraw from this region or that region.
Kelly, if I may, to jump in on that comment, because I think it's very important. This is all the question of proportion, because the Middle East will remain very important to relative power balances in Europe and in Asia. So as we are trying to rethink our strategy, and we are now updating the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, and we still don't have everybody, in the positions confirmed, et cetera, et cetera. So you're still looking at the very fluid period, I would argue, in how this will play itself out. But I think considering how interconnected these two theaters are and what an important kind of linchpin the Middle East will remain, I think that the idea that we will simply retrench, pull back, and let it all implode and have other external players come in, that's a very far-fetched concept. I think what we need to think about is how to properly calibrate our ability to operate in the region so as to have sufficient resources to really engage in shoring up deterrence and shoring up defense. Remember that the Chinese are announcing that they will have a 400-ship Navy by 2025. They are building landing crafts. They have an aircraft carrier building program. And the stress in the Indo-Pacific is going to become ever greater, which means that we have to be very conscious of what's going on there, and also how we actually address the kind of growing, I would say fragmentation, but growing stresses in Europe. China is a power in Europe. It's not a European power, but it's a power in Europe already. It's really engaged on a multiple number of issues economically. If you think of the People's Liberation Army Navy, getting into the Med, trying to punch through the Arctic, this is a larger geostrategic picture that we have to really get right. And the kind of approach, not the engagement, but the approach that we've pursued in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, I think will be a thing of the past. I don't think we will be looking for these kinds of transformative projects anymore, prove too costly, consume too many resources. And we find ourselves in a situation where our resources have been depleted. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'd like to go back to the Iran deal for just a moment. And specifically, Joost, you had said in a recent interview that the revival of the Iran nuclear deal is a clear signal, quote unquote, to Saudi Arabia that it has to scrap certain demands and address its rivalry with Iran. As we speak, there's ongoing security talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as Roxanne had mentioned. How will global powers view such developments between these two regional rivals? Will they play a concerted role in mediating tensions between Tehran and Riyadh amid further U.S. pullback from the Middle East? How does this change the state of play in that region?
Well, if we assume that what they want is a US retreat from the region, and I think that's a safe assumption, then they also have an interest in a balancing between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, Russia has already come out with a proposal for a regional security infrastructure and a process toward it. It's not the only one that has done so, but clearly that indicates that Russia sees that as a positive thing to work for. China has, as Roxanne rightly said, not engaged politically in the region and has no intention to do so. Let the Europeans and the Americans get their fingers dirty, as they have been for decades now. China would like to stay out while it continues its trade and investment with the region, but it also means that it wants to keep an even keel between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So I would expect these two countries to assist in any effort to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia closer together. I mean, they're not going to make peace, but they can certainly, reduce the temperature in the region and prevent some kind of inadvertent conflict that might break out. But ideally, they would like the United States to go away. Now, the United States would want to get involved in such an effort, diplomatic effort, because it clearly has an interest in what goes on in the Gulf region in particular, and in the Middle East more broadly. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis are not going to expose themselves to Iranian hegemony as they see it, or aspirations toward hegemony, without an American protective umbrella. So they will want to have an active American role in the background, guaranteeing security for them and reassuring them before they get into some serious discussions with the Iranians. So I think what we've seen in Baghdad between the head of Saudi intelligence and the deputy national security advisor of Iran, very positive, but these are initial preliminary talks to see where both countries stand. I don't expect it to go anywhere very far until and unless there is a nuclear deal back on the cards. But then it could take a positive turn, but I think it would have to include the United States, not because I'm advocating, but because I think it's not possible without. And that also will mean that would push the Russians and the Chinese to the corner, and they may be able to live with it because in the end they're not opposed to this effort in the first place.
Any two-finger comments, Roxanne?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, very much like the JCPOA negotiations are transactional, not transformational, that, trust isn't going to go up, but certain required deals are going to get done simply because it's going to leave everybody feeling somewhat better. The same, I would say, is the case with Saudi, Iran. And one of the key things that I think Saudi has encountered is that the cost of the Yemen war, if it continues, will simply preclude MBS's aspirations for the 2030 goals. It can't afford both. And so it's got every reason at this point, as things seem to be improving a bit with the JCPOA, to act and try to bring this to a resolution of some kind. And the Iranians certainly have expressed interest in this, because I think it's in their interest as well to be seen as a responsible member of the international community bringing a war to an end. So I just raise it on that level that I do think something will come of it. Definitely, we have to wait for the JCPOA to be more or less resolved. But I do have the feeling, I mean, they've worked together before under the twin pillar process at the time of Nixon. The trust is low, but the balance, although they're very different countries, is surprisingly similar in many ways. And I think that balance probably will help in them being able to go forward and get a deal, at least over Yemen.
I was going to ask you about Yemen next, Roxanne. Is there, I mean, are there signs that you are seeing that Saudi Arabia is more enthusiastic about ending the war there, and given all these positive signs, what say you about the Houthis and their position there? It's nice to say that the Saudis want to end the war, but are the Houthis in such a catbird seat, as they say now, to expect more concessions, and maybe they're not interested until maybe the embargo is lifted? Can you just lay out some of the stakes there?
Well, and I would certainly throw UAE into this discussion too, because it was part of the original coalition with Saudi Arabia. Then it withdrew, but definitely established a certain control area very critically of its own in Yemen, and in a way stood up to Saudi to say this is just not actually working for us. And made it very clear that it was very concerning that as the temperature was rising in the Gulf, that possibly one of the obvious places that would bear the brunt of conflict would be the states right on the Gulf on the western side, which Abu Dhabi was a bit concerned about. And so I think it's very much part of this. Now the Houthis, certainly there's two main factors, and I'll try to be brief. One is that it's often misrepresented, I think, that the recognized elected government of Yemen is standing up for the population, and the Houthis are the militias against them, because in effect the government, there was only one candidate, and he was the one that was the deputy of the previous president that was overthrown during the Arab uprisings. So one needs to have a little bit of context to recognize that no leader at the moment in Yemen has any legitimacy. The Houthis fought 5 wars against the establishment in Yemen, in the Yemen government, and won all 5 of them prior to this current one. So one also has to put it into that context. But I think they've made some extraordinary gains. And I think with pressure from Iran to, yes, the embargo has to be lifted. Yes, of course, that's part of what any negotiation is. And every negotiation begins with a betrayal, which is the fact that you have to give up something in order to bring it to some kind of a compromise. So I do think that there will have to be a number. It's not going to be easy. It's tricky. But I think the powers of Saudi and Iran are strong enough in order to bring that to some kind of conclusion.
Okay. I'd like to bring this over to Turkey, because we haven't talked a lot about Turkey, and it may not be in the pantheon of great powers along with China, Russia, and the United States at this very moment, but we know Erdogan would really like it to be. And I was wondering, I'm going to put this over to Andrew. What role do you think Turkey plays within the emerging multipolar landscape in the Middle East? How will its complicated relationship with both Russia and its fellow NATO member states impact this role? And what, if any, role did the emerging multipolar landscape play in 2020 in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Yeah, thank you.
Mouthful, but if you want to tackle any or all of those.
Quite a grab bag, but I'll try to tease
grab
out.
Bag, yes.
A couple of things. So 2 points we always have to keep in mind when it comes to Turkey. Number one, that it's the 2nd largest military in the NATO alliance. So a tremendous amount of NATO cohesion, NATO ability to act Also, the way NATO is structured in terms of using different military assets will continue to ride on Turkey. So we're trying to, in a sense, square the circle. Issues with the F-35 acquisition, for example, while the Turks were going to negotiate with the Russians on air and missile defense systems and whatnot. Turkey is clearly coming into its own, I would argue. They plan to deploy their first aircraft carrier this year. That's going to be a very significant development. The insistence that, in fact, on some issues in the region, Turkey pursues essentially a policy that does not align with what our priorities would be, and says it loud and clear. I would be very interested in hearing Dimitri's take on Russian-Turkish relationship, because sometimes it looks to me like there is more congruence, and sometimes I see a wire brush popping up. So I'm very curious to see how Dimitri sees this. I think what the Turkish factor will force us to do, and maybe that's the positive in all of the difficulties that we're having, it will force us to take a broader geostrategic view of the region. We tend to go into the weeds so deeply on the Middle East, and a lot of our analysts are structured that way, trained that way, so we start spinning and splitting hairs. We actually need to look at a much wider region, the Med and in its totality, and as far as the Arabian Sea on the other side, and understand how this would fit into the great power competition. That will put the Middle East in a different context, and Turkey as well, because the question we will then have to ask ourselves, does it matter as much as it used to what is actually happening within the region itself, within the Middle East, as opposed to how the external actors are shaping that environment and what tools we have to impact their decisions, rather than trying to solve the seemingly interminable, internal realignments and shifts and all of that. I tell my friends here, I'm currently working out of Germany. Europe's southern border is no longer on the Med. It's deep into Africa, into the Sahel. Africa is coming to Europe, big bore, and the Middle East with it. So we're looking at trying to think strategically on how we can leverage these different alignments, understanding, for example, what Erdogan really wants in terms of the end game. We talk about great power competition. I always ask my friends, okay, great power competition, what does a win look like in different regions? What is the end game? Because if we don't know that, then all of this is just, theorizing around the margins and throwing the word of choice for a given time. And I would love to hear, especially from Roxanne and from Joost, in this context of great power competition, with the changes that are now really putting a lot of stress on NATO because of how Turkey is repositioning itself. What does the end game, the win, look like in the Middle East that we might say it is protecting our interests and it is keeping the relative stability between the Asian theater and the European theater? Thank you.
Sorry about that. Dimitri, would you like to answer the question of the complicated relationship between Turkey and Russia and where that's at right now, before I go on and ask you another question?
Well, thank you, Kelly. In fact, I could only echo what Andrew has just said. It's a complex and complicated relationship, and that's the only way it can be, I think. You have Turkey, a rising regional power that is, as Andrew said very correctly, is coming into its own. And it keeps its very important relationship with the United States. I don't know to what extent Turkey cares about NATO as such, but certainly does care about the alliance with the United States. And at the same time, they are very pragmatically building relations with Russia. It's a relationship that has its bad moments and good moments. And I think that it's the combination of good and bad, the pluses and minuses, the agreements and clashes that are the that describe the nature of the relationship. I don't think it can be a predominantly cooperative relationship, because Turkish and Russian strategic interests are in many ways incompatible. On the other hand, both countries, or should I say both leaders, and I have more questions about what follows Erdogan and how this impacts on Turkey's future strategic orientation and its future foreign and security policy than what happens in Russia after Putin. I think Russia will be more or less proceeding along the lines it has been proceeding in the last couple of decades, but I'm not sure about Turkey. So for the time being, you have Turkey and Russia that disagree about a lot of things, but they have a certain interests in common, and it's a relationship that is that includes diplomacy and the use of force. You can have Putin and Erdogan sitting down to agree on something in Sochi, and then when it doesn't get traction, then somebody wipes out the other partner's battalion somewhere in the northwestern corner of Syria. This is how the relationship proceeds. And I think it will be proceeding along those lines. My prediction, I wouldn't say prediction, but my expectation is that there will be more conflict than cooperation between Russia and Turkey as Ankara's ambitions continue to grow. And Kelly, you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a harbinger of things to come. Central Asia and some other places where Russian and Turkish interests are very much at odds with each other.
I'd also like to direct our attention to Libya in that vein too, where Turkey and Russia are at odds, and in the proxy war taking place there. And I'd ask you, Dmitry, if you could talk a little bit about Russia's interests in Libya and its squaring against Turkey on that playing field, and if anybody else on the panel who might want to lend some insights into that proxy war that involves Qatar, Sudan, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, at the fringes, United States. So it is definitely a staging for great power competition and regional competition. So Dmitry, can you just start us off with a little bit of a Libya discussion?
Well, Kelly, I think that Russia's role in Libya has been blown out a little bit out of proportion. I think that Russia's interest in Libya, and in fact Russia's involvement in Libya, is a very different caliber than, let's say, Russia's involvement in Syria, and Russia's interests in Libya are incomparable to the interests linked to Syria. In Russia, basically, in Libya, Russia is basically seeking to be a party to sharing the future benefits of operating in an oil-rich country. That's basically it. Russia wants to recover what it lost as a result of what the Russians would say NATO's intervention in Libya and the ouster of Colonel Gaddafi and his regime. I don't think that there is much of a strategic interest. There may be, in principle, an interest in having another naval facility in the Eastern Med. Just having Tartus and that's all is makes you a bit vulnerable. But whether Libya is the right place for that is a question mark. I think that in terms of Russian-Turkish clashes of interest, Nagorno-Karabakh was so much more important. than was Libya. But and let me also say, you mentioned that, but let me just highlight that Russia was not doing a solo in Libya as it was doing and is doing in many ways in Syria. It is part of a coalition, if you like, informal coalition that other countries are also involved, and to which the United States, at least for periods of time, also associated itself with. So it's a far less, in my view, far less important story than some of the other stories of Russian involvement in the Middle East.
Joost?
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So I fully agree with Dmitry Trenin on the Russian role in Libya. You know, I've written a lot about sort of the four main conflict dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa. One is the conflict over governing systems, so between a regime and a people, if you want to put it black and white. Second one is Israel-Palestine conflict, very obviously, and all the conflicts that spin off from it. The third one is the Iranian one since 1979. Those two are all in the Middle East proper, not really in North Africa. But the fourth one is very much in play in North Africa, and that is the intra-Sunni Islam one between the UAE in particular and those who support the Muslim Brotherhood, be it Qatar, Turkey, and then of course the Muslim Brotherhood itself in Egypt. Now in Libya, we see this come together. The first conflict between the people and the regime, that was, you know, the Arab uprising in 2011, and everything afterward in trying to create a new order. And then the regional intervention that is around this dynamic about the nature of Islam and what role it should play in governance. And so then we see the external players coming in. The UAE, of course, militarily with Egypt, to some extent with Russia through the Wagner, security contractor company, and diplomatically maybe to some extent. And Turkey and Qatar on the side of the Tripoli government, and in fact on the side of international legitimacy, because the Tripoli government was set up by the UN in the end in 2015. Now, fortunately, maybe these two sides have come to a military stalemate, and it is sort of right in the middle geographically of Libya. And then both sides seem to be sort of content with it, and that has now opened up the possibility for a political process, which is the first time really since 2014 that we see what I think is a viable political process with a new prime minister, interim government, and prospect of elections later this year. So, the external factor has sort of fallen away, or it has been turned into a virtuous cycle. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to sound too optimistic in a situation that's still very difficult. But so regional actors and big powers can play a very destructive role. As long as that role plays, then local actors can solve nothing. If and when the external players come to some kind of understanding about their common shared interest in a place such as Libya, then the local actors can start working toward a better solution for Libya in this case. And that is what we're seeing right now. Whether it is sustainable is another question. But so we really have to understand the interplay between the outside actors and the internal actors.
Any other thoughts on Libya and the implications on, for external politics and intervention? Any thoughts on? Okay. Well, we only have about 5 minutes left. So I did want to ask a question because I know, Joost, that you're very much involved with the human rights issues. And as we've been talking about all of these great power questions, we're not really talking about how this might impact the people, the street. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on, how all of these developments that we've been speaking about today, whether it be the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the possibility of the Yemen war ending, just this rejiggering of these geopolitical relationships in the wake of the U.S. possibly starting to leave the region. How does this affect people? Because I know a lot of what we've been talking about are in the interests of monarchies and despotic regimes, proto-authoritarian regimes. Is any of this actually going to benefit the people, which often, their interests are in direct conflict with their monarchs and their rulers? So any thoughts on the human rights, I guess, implications of all of this?
I haven't really worked on human rights for more than 20 years now.
Okay.
I work for a conflict prevention organization, but my heart is in it. So,
Yes.
so I'm happy to actually address that particular question. We saw people rise up in 2011, and then more recently in 2019 in Iraq and Algeria and Lebanon and Sudan. So there's something very deep going on in the Middle East. Even in Iran, we've seen it. And this is an unfinished revolution, if it is a revolution, but there's certainly there's a desire on the part of people to get outside of the clutches of these regimes that are making deals with each other, elite deals. Now, elites making deals is better than elites making war, which we have also seen, of course. But it's a problem, because now look at what is happening in Israel-Palestine. Hamas decided to politicize and militarize a conflict in Jerusalem. Fatah and the Palestinian Authority stood back and basically showed themselves to be completely impotent. In the end, but these are the powers. The Palestinian people had wanted to go to elections. That chance was taken away from them. And so all they can do is to protest and to show their identity, to show their unity as a people, but without a unified leadership of any sort. And so there is a complete disconnect even there between people and the leaders. The leaders are not grounded in the people. And so whatever deals they make are not going to serve the people. And I think we see this now in all the countries. I mean, some of the Arab Spring countries have gone into civil war, of course, but even in Tunisia, what have we really seen that is benefiting the people of Tunisia vis-a-vis the elites that have governed the place since 2011? And that's the success story.
Roxanne, you had some thoughts.
First of all, I want to really compliment Joost on his summary of what the situation is in Libya, which is not an easy country to unwind so clearly, but also very much his point that the intra-Sunni conflict is one of the big threads, one of the themes, I think, that is at the next level down below big power activity in the region. And there are several, of course. There's also the Shia Sunni, and then there's the terrorism one, the ISIS and whatever. And so I think one of the things that we do see is that when big power conflict starts either coming to some kind of an agreement or just being withdrawn for their own reasons, then we see actions starting to take place at least the middle level, and possibly more in relation to the desires of the people. And I would say that, there's been a lot of debate since the Arab uprisings, and I thought Joost's point about, he's been working on conflict prevention rather than human rights. In many ways, that's sort of the security of people before you can get to the human rights of people in some ways. People just want to stop the conflict. And very often that's coming because of higher levels of conflict in either the regional or the international. And I think we're really at an incredible time of seeing some of these be worked out more in the region, by the people themselves. And I find that, again, another compliment to be paid. Andrew, your view of where the US has been a disrupting force and the way this has affected its own military prowess and choices in the region is fascinating, because I think that is going to change, and that will leave a little bit more space for those in the region themselves, which after all are the ones that have got to solve the problems on the ground. That is where it is. But I'd like to disagree with you as a possibility about one thing, and that is that I have the feeling that should the other shatter belt, the South, the China Sea area erupt, we'll see an enormous transfer of American power over there. And it's got all the same mechanisms and problems that the Middle East does, and happens to be, where certainly not a pivot, but certainly it could very rapidly change power shape and focus. And I think that would leave the US presence in the Middle East much diminished. And then we would possibly see a very, very different relationship of peoples and problems.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. This is a terrific comment because, in fact, if you look at where our focus is, it's in the Indo-Pacific. And especially now with the pressure building up on Taiwan, and Taiwan being so important in terms of the entire structure of our alliances in that region. It's the credibility issue, it's the issue of US position and who would respond and in what way. Remember that in Asia, we have a highly competitive security environment. It's not structured bureaucratically the same way as Europe is because of the overlapping elements, NATO, European Union, the rest of it. So I think that you're not only judging this correctly, if you look at the size of the joint force and the requirements that we're confronting, but in fact, a lot of our people are thinking in terms of actually a serious crisis possibly developing. Different timelines are being put at it. When I look at Chinese population trends, for example, I would argue that they would want to move sooner rather than later if they are to leverage, the moment that they find themselves in. If they calculate the extent to which the West is fractured internally, both in our own domestic politics, what you see in Europe, all of that would, from my perspective, encourage and embolden the Chinese pressure in the region to cash in. But I want to make one final comment, which I think is so important to the situation in the Middle East and the larger picture of the great power competition. We're a quintessentially naval power, the United States, right? We went to war twice in the 20th century, and then we engaged in the Cold War for one structural reason, in my view, to ensure that no one power would dominate the resources of Eurasia. And so the Cold War erupted against our former ally, against the previous bid for supremacy in the region. We are now looking at a situation where we're confronting not one, but two near-peer competitors, number one. What the Chinese are doing, in my view, is they're trying to flip the relationship between the maritime and land domains. They're building a supply chain network across Eurasia, which for Europe would have tremendous consequences if successful. If the Chinese can do this, you've got 17+1 about Belt and Road. And if you look at the level of ambition, that includes the high north, the tenders for nuclear-powered icebreakers that the Chinese are initiating. That would change Europe from a gateway for the transatlantic community into Eurasia, into being a tail end of the Chinese-dominated Eurasian-based land supply chain network. And that would flip the entire global power distribution, including the position that Russia would play in all of this. I have the strong feeling that we are running behind the curve when it comes to discussing what the win should look like and what the defeat in the great power competition would look like going forward, because we're still just bogged down in these smaller intra-theater discussions rather than thinking about how to leverage our limited resources that have been not wisely used, I would argue, for the last 2 decades, and still preserve the order that benefits us and benefits the Europeans and our democratic allies in the Indo-Pacific. I think this is a huge moment, the kind of great power politics inflection point that's going to define how we live, I would argue, and our children for quite some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to give you the last word because we're about 5 minutes over time, but I think that was a great way to end it. And I feel like we could spend the next hour talking about that very question. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much, all of you, for engaging this wonderful discussion, very high level discussion. And I know our audience got a lot out of it. We have audience here on Zoom, and we also have the audience on YouTube. Stick around, because in almost less than a half an hour, at 1:45, the Honorable Chaz Freeman, who's the former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, will be giving our virtual luncheon lecture, The Fade Out of Pax Americana in the Middle East, which I'm sure, given Chaz, is going to be an electrifying conversation. And so thank you again for your time, and look forward to the rest of the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you,
Thank
Kelly.
all.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.